The story of Gaddafi's leadership, according to mainstream news outlets, is one of an insatiable hunger for power. Western pundits describe Gaddafi's leadership as a rash overthrow of Libya's governing body, instating his autocratic reign over the Libyan people. He treated his citizens like peons, we're told, regularly brutalizing and depriving them of basic rights as they lived in constant squalor. The United States was left with no choice but to intervene. Is this true? While it is accurate to say that Gaddafi became the de facto leader of Libya in 1969, he only did so with the overwhelming support of the Libyan population. Prior to Gaddafi's reign, Libya was headed by King Idris I, a puppet instituted by the United Nations before the dust could settle after World War II. Under the reign of Idris, the citizens of Libya were subjugated under a monarchical dictatorship. After the discovery of large amounts of oil in the country, the United States, among others in the Western world, were colluding to create backdoor deals with the Libyan king. Instead of sharing the benefits of this lucrative deal with the impoverished masses, much of the money earned from these deals with European and American markets were concentrated in the hands of Idris and his future progeny, strengthening his leadership and furthering the economic plight of the Libyan people. Under Idris's reign, Libya was one of the world's poorest countries, with a 40% infant mortality rate and a paltry 6% literacy rate. Idris allowed multiple U.S. military bases to be established in the region, and, after his exile following Gaddafi's overthrow, was formally charged with crimes of corruption by Libyan authorities. In many ways, Gaddafi's rise to power was not derived from a bloodlust of authority, but an earnest effort by the people of Libya to cement their independence from the hidden hands of Western powers. As for the squalor described by the media, after harnessing control over its oil supplies, the Libyan economy soared to historic heights under Gaddafi's leadership. Rather than keeping the wealth for himself, Gaddafi decided to give it to the people, resulting in the highest GDP per capita in the African continent. Under this new leadership, electricity, education, and medical treatment were all free to Libyans. Literacy rates grew to 87%, 25% with university degrees. Centralized banks would lend to Libyans at 0% interest. Newlyweds were given $50,000 to purchase a home, and an aquifer was irrigated to provide all Libyan people with equitable access to water in what was called the eighth wonder of the world. Despite these drastic improvements in the Libyans' prosperity, Gaddafi's leadership was marred by unscrupulous charges of ethical violations and crimes in the decades preceding the NATO intervention. The claim that Gaddafi contracted his intelligence officers to bomb Pan-American Flight 103 in Scotland, killing 270 civilians, resulted in strict economic sanctions by the United States toward the Libyan government. An ultimatum from the United Nations forced an admission of guilt from Gaddafi, as well as a mandate to pay the victims' families in restitution in exchange for lifting the sanctions. Gaddafi, however, routinely denied any responsibility, and the Libyan intelligence officer who was sent to prison for allegedly orchestrating the event, Abdelbaset al-Megrahi, was convicted using the testimony of a single witness who had been paid $3 million by American authorities. Claims of mass killings in Libyan prison Abu Salim were unable to be verified by independent humanitarian agency Human Rights Watch, and the purported mass graves behind the prison were found to be animal bones by CNN investigators. American claims of torture and mass rapes came at odds with the United Nations 2011 report of Libya, which, quote, appreciated the country's commitment to uphold human rights on the ground. The blame of the 1986 discotheque bombing in West Berlin, which killed 2 Americans and injured hundreds more, was placed squarely on Gaddafi, resulting in a bombing campaign on Libya days later. The judge of the case, Peter Marhofer, stated that American intelligence officers failed to provide any evidence to substantiate the claim that Gaddafi was involved. If Gaddafi was indeed a tyrant, few could argue that life under his leadership was any worse than that of the previous Western-backed dictator. And if the cloudy evidence for human rights violations were enough to warrant his killing, then surely Saudi Arabia, who has hundreds of overt charges against them, and has been lambasted by human rights agencies for decades, has been met with swift and resolute action by the United States and their global quest for democracy. And the same intervention must have been reciprocated towards the United States when the world discovered that Obama was issuing international drone strikes on U.S. citizens, circumventing the Bill of Rights and the right to a fair trial. As you may have guessed, Saudi Arabia remains one of America's closest allies, and no formal charges ever materialized against Obama. If Gaddafi's revolt of 1969 was a treasonous coup d'etat, the United States and NATO-aided revolt of 2011 was no different. The Libyan Liberation Army, funded by the United States and sporting the flag of the previous Libyan dictator, ruthlessly tortured and slaughtered women and children in the region. NATO was quick to launch 110 Tomahawk missiles against prominent targets, slaying Libyan civilians in the process. In response to the NATO bombings, Gaddafi said, quote, "This is blatant colonialism. It does not have any justification. This will have serious consequences on the Mediterranean and on Europe. In 2011, they are colonizing us, massacring us, and imposing one no-fly zone after the other and one military attack after another. What is this racism? What is this hatred?" In the months that followed, the US-funded Libyan rebels, which contained members of Al-Qaeda, continued to gain traction. As Western media outlets described support for Gaddafi as, quote, "shallow," on-ground reporting showed the complete opposite. During the NATO bombing campaign, approximately 1.7 million Libyan patriots gathered around Tripoli, approximately 95% of the city's population, or 1/3 of the country's, waving the signature green flags in support of Gaddafi and decrying the bombing campaign in what they considered to be an act of Western imperialism. One Libyan witness, Susan Farjan, said in response to the so-called freedom fighters, quote, "We lived in democracy under Muammar Gaddafi. He was not a dictator. I lived in freedom. Libyan women had full human rights. It isn't that we need Muammar Gaddafi again, but we want to live just as we did before." These pleas fell on deaf ears in the Western world, however, and the bombing was not curtailed. The rebellion movement culminated in the brutal killing of Gaddafi, who was sodomized with a bayonet and subsequently shot to death. And just as quickly as the Gaddafi propaganda campaign surfaced in the media, it was all but forgotten weeks later. Was humanitarianism the true reason for military involvement by Western forces in Libya? After this extremely costly intervention, it is fair to presume that democracy must have prevailed in the region. However, in the years following the sustained bombing campaign, living conditions deteriorated greatly. The NATO-supplanted government resulted in major political fractures within the Libyan population. The advent of slave trading in Tripoli draws the ire of the world, with African slaves regularly dying by sea on board ships. Humanitarian crises are happening in Libya right now, yet, this time, have been seemingly omitted by US politicians. What could be the true reason for involvement, if not for securing the freedom of Libyans? Little known to the average American, Libya was in possession of 143 tons of bullion worth approximately $6 billion. Gaddafi planned to utilize the country's supply of gold through the creation of a new form of currency to challenge the American dollar. By uniting the African and Arab nations under what was termed the gold dinar, a broad coalition would be formed that posed a formidable threat to Western interests, just mere months before international intrusion. As many know, the United States dollar has not been financially backed by a hard currency since the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1971, a contract to set the reserve global currency to the US dollar, which itself would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate. Gaddafi's ambitious proposal would grant the people of the newfound Afro-Arabic coalition unequivocal immunity against the hyper-devaluation that had plagued the US dollar in the preceding years. Could this be the true reason for intervening? In a strange turn of events, Libyan officials seem to have miraculously lost the password of their own vault of gold after the Western-backed ousting of Gaddafi, making it virtually impossible to quantify the current amount of gold held. Additionally, Libya's current internationally recognized leader, Fayez al-Siraj, is recommending selling whatever gold remains to NATO forces in exchange for economic aid and a transition to the US dollar. Perhaps the most damning indictment of all, however, is leaked correspondence with former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, in which an email suggests that the bastion of gold that Gaddafi harbored was the real reason for Western forces character assassinating and, ultimately, overthrowing the Libyan regime. The real story surrounding Libya and our intervention is much more complicated than we are led to believe. Today, NATO is quick to interfere in other countries' matters in the name of humanitarian efforts. Widely considered an act of war, no-fly zones were instated over Libya, yet a constitutional declaration of war was never approved by the US Congress. Let the case of Libya show why the American public and the world should be wary of any international meddling when humanitarianism is used as an excuse.
I made it clear that Gaddafi had lost the confidence of his people and the legitimacy to lead.
Should understand this war. We are with Muammar Gaddafi. All the Libyan people with Muammar Gaddafi.
This morning, NATO admits that an air raid on Libya's capital, Tripoli, killed civilians on Sunday. CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi is in Tripoli with more.
Did it have anything to do with your visit? No, I'm sure it did.